the other just transition piece is the piece about the customer as well, and making sure that every customer and the whole of society takes part and benefits from the transition, not just those. If I can afford an EV and I can afford an expensive retrofit upgrade to my housing, my home, an energy retrofit, and I can afford that, but others can't. I think it's really important, and this is where policy really steps in.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm John Feddersen, co-founder and chief executive of Aurora. And my guest on the show today is one of the longest serving CEOs of a major European utility. Until very recently, he was the president of Eurelectric, which is the power industry sector association at the European level. He's a director of Energy UK, one of the UK's leading sector associations in the energy sector. He possesses enormous breadth of experience across the power sector, having held leadership roles in generation, in networks, and in retail supply businesses before leading ESB. He's an engineer by training. My guest on the show today is Pat O'Doherty, CEO of ESB. Welcome, Pat.
Thank you, John.
And it's wonderful to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Can I ask a bit about your journey to start with? So you joined ESB in the early 80s. Did you think at that point in time that you would still be there right now?
Not at all. Actually, I had in my first 10 years, I had a couple of offers to leave, and thankfully I didn't take them up. Like in ESB, I'm in ESB nearly 40 years. I joined straight out of college in 1981. And no, I did not join ESB with the ambition of becoming CEO. Let's just nail that one stone dead. But you work through, it's a big organization. And the great thing about ESB is you get plenty of opportunity to do different things. And I've been very, very lucky in that I had bosses down the years who encouraged me to do very different things. And I've tried very different things. I've moved around the organization, sometimes not always of my prompting or when making somebody else suggested that I take a move. And there's a number of moves that I took which were career defining and pointed me in different directions. And I'm here today as a result of those. But, I suppose what's in me is I'm motivated to make a difference. I'm motivated to be better and to improve. And, each time you're doing something, you see an opportunity to do something different. And one thing leads to another. And then you wake up someday and you say, do you know what? I can be a director of this company. And then eventually say, I can be CEO of this company. And that's the way it goes. That's the way it went for me anyway.
Interesting. And in the UK at least, and probably Australia as well, I think there's this sense that if you go back 20 years or 25 years, the big oil and gas companies were the places that the smart graduates wanted to go. This was, it was sort of, I can go on an oil rig in Nigeria, or I can go to the Gulf of Mexico, I can move around the shells. And that was where everyone wanted to go. And I think to some extent, the utilities and the network companies were seen as, okay, it's a steady career. There's not a lot of excitement. Nothing's changing. We're building another power station every now and then. And it seems like it's totally flipped around. And you go to a recruiting event with a Shell hat on, and it's a sort of, things get thrown at you basically nowadays. But you go with the sort of power sector, name badge, and you're very popular. Did it feel like that in the 80s at ESB, or was there something about the nature of the Irish market?
I'm unique enough. I'm unique enough in ESB and possibly unique enough in the power sector in that I'm an electronics engineering graduate. So I studied electronics and I majored in telecommunications. I joined ESB specifically because I was interested in control systems and SCADA systems, and the power sector gave you that opportunity. So I sought out ESB, and my career in ESB breaks into a number of distinct chunks. I was 10 years in that telecommunications system control area. I was another 10 years in what's now known as the networks and retail businesses. They were together at the time. And then I was nearly 10 years in the generation business, and now 10 years as CEO, or 9.5 years as CEO. So a lot of my college graduates were joining Schlumberger and traveling across the world. They were joining the oil majors. I was particularly interested. ESB came and they sought graduates for a particular purpose, and I was hooked because it just corresponded to my area of study, telecommunications and control systems, and that's what brought me into ESB.
Interesting. So in some ways, sort of 30 years ahead of your time. There's a lot of graduates that are now thinking. What do you talked about 10 years in the CEO role? That's long for a CEO, right? CEO tenure tends to be a lot shorter than that. It's a precarious existence. What do you put the longevity down to?
Look, I was appointed for an initial 7 years, and then the board asked me to stay on for further 3 years, and that 3 years is up now. And you get to a point where it is, it's the time has come, and I feel at this point there's another shift taking. I took over in the teeth of a recession. So when I took over at the end of 2011, big recession here in Ireland, and you get a sense now that we're about to start another chapter. And so the last 10 years was spent very much about the power sector really putting its own house in order in decarbonizing itself, and then figuring out the role that it was going to play in the wider decarbonization of society. And the next decade now, in Eurelectric, for example, it's called the electric decade. So the next decade now, the changes we've spoken about for the last 10 or 20 years as coming, we're now living in them. So the next decade is about implementing. 2030 is a big milestone en route to 2050 or 2040, 2045, net zero. So, that's kind of, and for me, looking back over the last 10 years, it doesn't feel that long. I was never bored in the job. The job has, I can tell you, definitely not been bored. But, for me, the role of chief executive is very much about a facilitator and an enabler. The thing about an electricity company, utility company, and ESB is no different from many others, is that it's a complex stakeholder environment. Energy is at the heart, electricity is at the heart of policy. So the CEO's role is very much an enabler, and it's about getting the best out of people and building a team of people. And I've been blessed and lucky that the team I've had is a super team. So I haven't felt, as I said, it hasn't been very, very, very long, but as I said, it's time now. I know myself that there's another wave coming, and it needs a fresh injection. And so I'm moving on, but I'm moving on very, very proud of what we've achieved in ESB over the last decade.
Yeah, and of course, for those that don't know, Pat is stepping down towards the end of this year. So when you look ahead, you described an enormous amount of change. And as you say, the 2020s for our sector is vital in terms of the transformation of the energy system. Do you think the job of the CEO is getting harder? Compare it to maybe the 80s or the 90s. Things moved. I think things moved a bit slower back then in terms of the pace of change in the power sector. Is it getting more complicated?
No disrespect to my predecessors, it probably is. And the next, when you're doing this in a decade time, and somebody's looking back to say, "Sure, that fella had it easy as well." It is. It's for a sector that there's a perception about is not fast moving. It is really transforming. It's a complex industry, so the value chain alone is complex, and then you overlay on top of that what's happening on the consumer, on the customer side, and then you overlay the enablement of technology. So whether it's digital technologies or whether it's technologies that are going to really, really drive the demand side, it's a complex mix of things. But back to that point about the stakeholder piece is increasingly complex. Between consenting, between environmental, the whole area of transparency. But also the power sector is putting itself very much center stage in the transition. I use the metaphor that, it's drawn from a book I was given many years ago, describing about a state of higher performance, but it's we're walking on a bridge as we're building it. And the power sector has set itself very much center stage in the transition to a low carbon economy powered by clean electricity. And we're making decisions today in a in what I would call a fog of uncertainty. So 15, 20 years ago, when you pulled the trigger on an investment, a major investment, there was much, much more certainty. Now there's, with markets, with the way technology is going, there's an awful lot less certainty. So being agile and being nimble, and you're barely taking a step before the next step is known. And I think that's what makes it complex on the one hand, but also very, 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 very exciting. I'd love to be back in my 20s joining this industry. I really would.
Yeah. And I think for all those 20-year-olds listening, there's probably at least 3 decades of like working it out and uncertainty for us to work through on the way to net zero. So it's a pretty good career. You'd be retired by the end of that, just about, if you're entering in your 20s. So I think personally a good way to spend your career anyway. Is a corollary of what you're saying, Pat, that it's less about electrical engineers in the future? There's this great history, National Grid in the UK, state-owned utilities all over the world of electrical engineering schools producing the leaders within certainly transmission environment, but also generation and those others. Is the future about software engineers? Is it more about financial engineering and risk management and less about electrical engineering?
I think the future is about all of that, but of course, I suppose I'm an engineer, and I would say this: so engineers have a unique value proposition. It's to do with engineering, it's to do with their development and their training. But I don't think being an engineer or an electrical engineer gives you a right to be a CEO of an electricity utility. It's much, much more than that. As I said, I studied electronics. I didn't study power engineering. Well, I studied power engineering in my early years in college, but but like if you look at what's happening now and the skills, and even in the people we're recruiting, so we're recruiting masters and PhDs in mathematics and in science and in physics. We're recruiting legal graduates, we're recruiting commercial business graduates, HR people. We're recruiting people with deep analytic skills. We're recruiting lots of marketing people. So anybody from any of those disciplines that can grow. And I have grown in the role, and all my time in ESB, everything has been about personal growth. But people who grow to demonstrate the kind of leadership that's needed to take on a serious senior role and an executive role and a CEO role, any one of them people can aspire to being CEO. It's a complex environment, and it's now about leadership. And I believe fundamentally that what the electricity sector is about, and decarbonization is doing this. We found our place again. I'm a real believer that electricity has, the communities and the society that we have today has been based on electricity. It's an industry that's 100 years old. Deep in the DNA of all of those electrical and mechanical and civil engineers I just spoke about is this sense of purpose, this sense of connection with community and society. And it's not about the kilowatt hours, I would say all the time. It's about what's done with them. So electricity is an enabler, and we have a deep sense of purpose. It's deep in our DNA in electricity companies. We were all state-owned monopolies at one stage as well, and that's where we came from. That's all changed. We spent the last 25 years with markets, competition, liberalization, deregulation. And climate change now has brought a sense of purpose back to us. And I think the second coming of electricity now is what's going to be done with electricity. We're looking inwards to decarbonize our own processes and our own systems. But when we get that right, then it's electricity as a vector is a great term now, but it's to decarbonize society. So that's the exciting thing about all of this. And it's connected to that purpose we've had, I believe, for nearly a century.
Yeah, and what you say about the breadth of people now coming to ESB, to me that's one of the most reassuring things about the future of the power sector. Is I kind of pinch myself at the talent and at the talent of the people that walk in our door at Aurora who want to join, and it's sort of there's just 10 years ago these people may have gone to the City of London, they may have gone to Wall Street or whatever, but these super clever people want to play a role in decarbonisation.
Yeah, I believe that's important, John, because you have to work hard now to attract the best talent, and you want the people who are going to reimagine and re-engineer the system of, and it's a massive system. I don't mean a system in technical terms, in the broadest possible, whether it's and that's putting the customer very much center stage. And today, graduates and people joining companies today want to be connected with a sense of purpose, and they want to work for a responsible business that's feeling it's making a difference. So the power sector is right up that street, you know.
Yeah. Do you? So you must hear. So ESB's from it's about 97% government owned. Employees own shares in the businesses or incentive scheme. There's a big trend towards what's called ESG investing, or environmental social governance. I mean, I don't know if you call it that, but when you're state owned, that's kind of your job in a sense. Yeah, okay, yes, the government wants a nice dividend, but they also are prepared to forego that if it means that you're achieving better social or environmental or governance outcomes. So there's a sort of broad question of what do you make of this ESG movement in a sense, but as someone who's been doing this for 40 years, how do you measure how you're going on an ESG trajectory? Because it can be a bit fuzzy at times.
Yeah, so I suppose first of all, let's talk about measurement. So we've signed up for a number of things. So the CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. So I think with ESG, it's really, really important. Congruence is important. So that means what you say and what you do are completely lined up, and you do it according to your values. And that's something that we spend a lot of time thinking about. So we were recognized by CDP as an A-list company recently in terms of climate action and corporate sustainability. So that's a kind of an objective, independent measure. We also do, we subscribe to reputation tracking. So we do a survey of our top 350 stakeholders every few years, and that finds its way into our action plans. But so ESG is really, really important. So for example, even now, you borrow money in the marketplace, so your ESB credentials will be tested, and then you'll have to demonstrate them. So ESG is becoming a real mainstream part of business. We haven't been calling it ESG, but we've had this deep connection with communities and societies. We've a very deep CSR program. So we've been doing, various. We've got an Energy for Generations fund where we would put €1 million to every year into society. So homelessness and suicide prevention, disadvantage education, through our commercial businesses then. So basically community support programs where we're impacting on communities. So we've always done that. But we're state owned as well. But I think, so I suppose what state ownership gives us an ethos. So we believe we're in the public service business, but as a commercial state company, we're also commercial. We don't get any handouts from the state. We have to borrow. So our funding comes from whatever money is thrown off, cash is thrown off by the business, or we fund ourselves through debt funding or project financing in the international debt markets. We pay a dividend. So we benchmark ourselves in terms of commercial performance against the best commercially in the private sector. And paying a dividend to my shareholder is important to the shareholder, but it's also important to me in terms of the values and the behaviors that it drives in the business around commerciality. But as a state-owned company, we have something that's, I suppose, different in our DNA also.
Interesting. And it's a follow-up question on that. You see a lot of energy companies, or a lot of companies in general, making these long-term commitments. We're going to be net zero by 2050, those types of things. And you talked about congruence, and obviously it's hard to be congruent if your CEO is not going to be there in 2050 when you're making the commitment. Do you think those sorts of commitments are overrated or underrated in terms of enabling the transition, those big long-term ones?
I think those commitments are really, really important. And even though a CEO is around at a point in time, somewhere between the board, the CEO and the executive team, there's I suppose a period of time that goes beyond the CEO's own time. So, but it is really, really important. And I think, companies making commitments and then living by those commitments are really important. And it's a real statement of intent. So, for example, part of our business, of course, is power generation with fossil fuels. So doing something around that is we have to do it. It's just existential. But also getting our business processes in order and making sure all other aspects of our business are more sustainable, whether it's what we do with waste, whether it's what we do with water, and in terms of our buildings, how we heat and how we ventilate our buildings, and indeed, whether it's travel, whether it's internal travel in Ireland or international travel. So we're no different from other businesses who are not in the power sector in terms of creating sustainable futures for all parts of the business. And I think that's really, really important. Like for me, example is really, really important.
One more digression then, and there's a theme that's come up a few times in this podcast around the benefit of government ownership in enabling companies to transition and decarbonize themselves. The canonical example is Dong, obviously a oil and natural gas company, which has transitioned into being a global renewables leader. Similar sorts of trajectories for Vattenfall, for Equinor. You obviously used to be called Statoil. And then the multi-billion dollar question at the moment is, can a private sector entity make that same transition, a big one like a BP or a Shell? Do you think and obviously ESB still runs coal power station, Money Point's closing down, these sorts of things. Do you think that transition is easier to make as a state-owned enterprise? The dividend notwithstanding, can you say to government, look, we're not quite going to give you the same money we thought we would this year because we're decarbonizing the economy?
Doesn't kind of work like that for me anyway. That if I rock up and say, listen, I need to hold on to the dividend because I'm, like governments, and this is all part of the give and take between a government as a shareholder and a commercial company. So government expect their dividend, and they still expect you to do the right thing and to take a leadership role and be an exemplar in terms of government policy. So look, that's just the way it is. Like we decide. So we decide as a company between the executive and the board. We decide what it is. We know what government policy is. We make decisions that are commercially based, but there are also decisions that have to, adhere, if you like, to the expectations of government in terms of ESB being an exemplar in Ireland in particular. I believe it's ultimately, this is down to the leadership of an executive and of a board, whether you're state owned or whether you're private, whether you're a private entity. It is all the same. You might have different types of shareholders to manage as a private owned entity, but at the end of the day, sustainability is good for business. Business is good for sustainability. And everything, the world and its mother now, we want to raise funds in the international marketplace. You have to be able to show your ESG, your sustainability, and your green credentials. Green financing now is becoming very, very, very important for companies in terms of raising funding.
Yeah, interesting. And a really great perspective from someone who is making that transition, has made that transition in many ways. I've got a couple of Eurelectric questions, right? From the outside, spectacular decade for Eurelectric, right? We've gone, I think the thinking in Brussels at least is, well, firstly, it's net zero is the target. The European carbon price is up at 60 euros at the moment, as high as it's ever been. And in general, I think, while there's a lot of support for hydrogen and molecules, most of that's through the power sector. So the power sector is really perceived by policymakers as having the central role in the decarbonisation of the European economy. So that's great. Great job. Amazing. What are the challenges for Eurelectric over the next decade, do you think? Is the battle won, or are there more battles to fight?
No. The battle is not won at all. I think the next decade is going to be defining. So in the past decade in Eurelectric, we did quite a bit of work in terms of what was the role that the electricity sector, the power sector, was going to play. So today, 20% of emissions come from the power sector, 20% of end-use energy consumption is electricity. With electrification of heat and transport and decarbonisation of the power sector, that number can go between 60 and 80%. So 60 to 80% of end-use energy by 2050 from electricity. That is just a staggering number. So based on some work we did in the last 4 or 5 years, that's where we positioned it. So it's about it's about decarbonisation. It's about electrification of heat and transport. And then, of course, as you say, then the hard to electrify sectors then that aren't amenable to direct electrification, then something else. So hydrogen, green hydrogen produced by electricity. So the world is electric. And so I think the last decade had two broad thrusts to it. One was we set about decarbonizing our own industry, and we start thinking about the role that it's going to play in decarbonizing the economy. The next decade now is 2030 is an important stopping off point on net zero. 55% reduction in CO in carbon dioxide emissions now in the European Union. And so by 2030, somewhere north of 30% of end use consumption will be electricity as the technology started bed in now. So heat transport, heat pumps, 70 million cars, 50 million heat pumps in Europe. Pick a number, 100 million European consumers self-generating. So I think the technologies that we need to meet the 2030 targets are known today. It's about implementation. And so while we've gotten the supply side right, it's all about getting the demand pulled now. So it's everything policy, everything else now is about getting, customers to adopt electric vehicles, to adopt heat pumps, the self-consumption. And that's where the power sector, in terms of its customers, in terms of its relationship with customers, has to create that draw. Of course, markets on the other side have to do that as well. While at the same time, then we have to invest in the decarbonized technologies then, which will be wind and solar, on and offshore wind and solar for the next decade. And then during this decade, we have to figure out what technologies we're going to deploy beyond 2030 and scale and commercialize those. So it is just all go for the next decade.
So the battle's not won. There's a lot of battles that sound
like. A lot
of
battles still to be won.
And
big issues about consenting, about permitting and consenting. It's very, very difficult now. Building transmission, building onshore wind is difficult. In Ireland, for example, we have to get, Irish government has decided that 70% of electricity generated will come from renewables. That requires 5 gigawatts of offshore wind. We don't have an offshore wind industry in Ireland yet. So learning quickly from others that have done this, particularly the United Kingdom, and getting the consenting and the route to market arrangements in place and getting the infrastructure built to enable it is a big challenge.
It's a really interesting topic and it's not just an Irish topic. Germany, horrible congestion from north to south.
Yes.
Inability to build overhead lines. Onshore wind in Bavaria is difficult. Do you think, let me digress on this briefly. Do you think the answer, and you're a big network company owner, right? So do you think the answer here is we need to change the public's mind? Or do you think the answer here is we need to come up with new technologies, whether that is, okay, we'll pay an extra £10 a megawatt hour to get the turbines in the sea rather than on the land, or instead of copper being 100% of the answer to congestion, we'll use software, we'll use batteries. And obviously that is an existential threat to someone who runs a regulated network business. Potentially, it could be a huge opportunity as well, depending on how it's structured. But where do you think the answer is? Do we need to change people's minds, or do we need to give them alternatives?
I kind of, I suppose we talk a lot about changing people's minds. And I think as a sector, we need to be really careful about that, because our minds need to change as well. And back to that bridge I was talking about, building it while you walk, I think we all have to walk arm in arm across this bridge. And we have to learn what the customer wants. And in a dialogue with customer, and, another word that's used here by our minister in Ireland, Eamon Ryan, is the word citizen. And I think that's a really interesting word, because, we interact with customers, we interact with citizens, and we interact with communities. And everybody has to travel their own carbon reduction journey. And us, the power sector, understanding what we can do and must do to make that possible. So I just fear a little bit about changing minds. There is a piece of changing minds in it. There's a piece about engaging to, with communities and with customers to make all that happen. But I think we have to be open-minded as well. Like the power sector for years, like it's not that we have a whole pile of products in our product basket for the last 100 years. We don't have, I say we've two products, but it's one product with two versions. We've got electricity, a night rate and a day rate version of it, pretty much on a take it or leave it basis. And that's why I worry about the changing minds piece, because we need to make sure that we have an open mind about how we change minds. So smart metering is going to make a huge difference. The role of the network is absolutely critical to enable the electrification need in transport. And the big upside here is that 60+ percent, 60 to 80% of end use energy that will be electricity by 2050, from 20% today. So we're 20% of emissions. So going from 20% of the problem to 60 to 80% of the solution is the big upside. But if we rock up and pile into copper and think that copper is the only solution, that's a bad deal for the customer. So we have to, software, demand management, demand control, and putting technology in the hands of the customer where the customer decides when and how, and indeed what price they pay for their electricity is really, really important. So we have to reimagine a totally new system. And the networks are really important. And how regulators are incentivizing companies to do this, how regulators come to the table also in terms of tariff design, network tariff design becomes so critical. Politically, that is very, 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 very tricky. And it's really important that in all of this, that when we get the design of tariffs right, to make sure that all of society benefits, and that you don't have a large group of people who are currently in fuel poverty and can't afford the transition end up picking up all of the fixed costs or the residual fixed costs. So there's a complex societal and social transformation in here as well, which brings policy and governments into the picture.
Yeah, and you touched on, I've tempted to talk about market designs for, efficient build out of the network and managing congestion, but that would be a whole podcast in and of itself. So I'm not going to go there, but you touched on a really interesting point. So we've been talking about changing minds, and presumably I think we both agree there's a role in changing minds, but there's also the sort of ensuring a just transition. If you are a coal worker in Eastern Germany, your vocation probably, well, by decree from the German government, your vocation doesn't exist beyond 2038 at the latest. In the UK, if you work in coal power stations, 2025 is when there are no longer people employed with your profession. We see it in consumer bills. A broad question, right? But how do you see the utilities' role in enabling the just transition? So there's a variant of this, which is government, you set the rules and we play the game. And if you want a just transition, fine, go for it. Just tell us what the game is. Ideally, give us a bit of notice so you're not changing the rules as we play it. How do you see a utilities role, whether it's privately owned or publicly owned? I see this as an issue that SSE, that RWE, that Iberdrola, all of these guys face across Europe.
Yeah, look, I think we have a role. It's not solely government set the rules and we play by them. Policy for sure has a big part to play in this, and I think our sector is going to be judged on the way in which we become involved and facilitate this. So what do? We bring big balance sheets and we spend a lot of money. So there's reskilling, upskilling, cross-skilling, and utilities using their procurement power, and our spend to drive kind of new business models and to drive, I suppose, the move away, if you're to support the move away from some, say, the traditional, I suppose, particularly on the fuel side. And this is not easy. And I suppose, different countries in Europe are starting in different places. So Germany and Eastern Europe, large coal. If you're in the Nordic country and you've got 100% hydro or 50% hydro and 50% nuclear, it's an entirely different game altogether. So utilities do have a role here. I think also collaborating, utilities collaborating with academia, collaborating with partners to bring new technologies to bear. So the whole area of heating, the whole area of car charging infrastructure, there's new technologies needed. There's new software systems needed, and again, utilities working with partners and partnerships. These are all new growth areas where new jobs can be created. Utilities do definitely have a role in that. But I think also the other just transition piece is the piece about the customer as well, and making sure that every customer and the whole of society takes part and benefits from the transition, not just those. If I can afford an EV and I can afford an expensive retrofit upgrade to my housing, my home, an energy retrofit, and I can afford that, but others can't. I think it's really important, and this is where policy really steps in, and incentives and tax breaks and low-cost financing based on need is really, really important. So there's a huge government policy piece is in the middle of this.
Yeah, that's a really, and it's sort of my take, at least on the UK and some of Northern Europe, is the EV one. The consumer seems to be on board, but at some of that the heat decarbonisation is where we're starting to get some real pushback, and we're going to need some creative politicians who are solving that problem.
Heat is really complex. So Ireland, maybe 40% of homes are heated by natural gas, and the rest by a variety of solid and liquid fuels, fossil fuels. Britain is completely different, over 80%, and the Netherlands and Germany. So there's a huge, not just philosophical debate, it's a total debate to be had about what's going to displace or replace gas in heating in many, many countries in Europe. So electrification, so in Ireland, for example, the low-hanging fruit, as it were, is oil burners and solid fuel burners in rural homes not connected to the gas network. Proportionally, much more of those here in Ireland than there will be in Britain or in Germany. And that allows then for whatever is going to happen on the technology side, whether it's going to be hydrogen, for example, in a domestic gas, or whether it's going to be green hydrogen through the gas network. These are all things that have to be worked out as well. And there's big complex engineering, technical, political, societal issues all in the middle of that.
Yeah, indeed. Just one quick one following up on that. So cybersecurity is on my mind at the moment. We had a big pipeline shut down in the US recently. There was a ransom asked for over there. We had the Irish, I don't know if they've sorted it out yet in Ireland, but they had the Irish health system was hacked. Are we doing well enough on cybersecurity as a power industry, Pat? Or do you in the next 10 years, do you foresee a big incident that costs people their lives and disrupt our societies in Europe?
There's a frightening piece if you think about it. If you get a significant disruption to your control systems, your energy management, your national dispatch systems, your network systems, or power stations, it's just frightening to think about the consequences of that are. So what's really, really important now is, so go back to my past when I was a SCADA engineer on control systems, they were completely isolated, not connected to anything else. Now everything is connected to everything. So your operational technology systems are connected to your information technology systems. We'll be soon connecting through smart meters into people's homes. So everything is connected to everything. So it is really, really important that cyber is designed in, not as an afterthought, but designed in to cyber by design, as really, and resources are invested significantly in cyber, in tackling cyber, and in configuring for cyber. So for example, we have single policy governing our operational systems and our information systems, a single cyber policy. I think that is really, really important. The other thing, of course, is your employees are effectively your first line of defense with all this malware coming in. So a lot of investment in being vigilant and in making sure that your employees are well up to speed in terms of their role in cyber. But it is the prospect of what could happen is frightening, and that's the thing that should motivate us. And I think it's really, really important too that there's, particularly the power sector. The power sector is of national strategic importance. So strong tie-up with government policy on cyber is really, really important as well.
Yeah. And there's something we saw it in Texas in February this year. I think we've seen it with COVID as well, that human beings are just not very good with things that don't happen very often, but have big consequences. The things that happen annually, you take out an insurance policy or it's coming, but if it's a 1 in 20 or a 1 in 30 year event, there's something about our brains that says it never happens. When actually a 1 in 30 risk that has catastrophic implications is worth investing a lot of money on an ongoing basis. And we just we need to get around that human failing. I think.
And I think COVID. The one thing the power sector has shown in COVID is that we plan for emergencies. We plan for major weather events. So like in ESB, we had a pandemic response plan that goes back to SARS in 2006 or 2008. So that's what we blew the dust off in February of last year. And I think the power sector has stood up right across the world and shown how resilient it has been. And that's about investment in the infrastructure, but also investment in, emergency response planning and business continuity planning, and scenario planning, doing dry runs of various types of events, various types of emergency events, including cyber events, and not taking anything ever for granted. But cyber now, every utility will have cyber way up there on its risk register.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so I always conclude the show with a segment that I call overrated or underrated. And basically, I'll present to you some concepts in the energy transition, and I'll ask you if you think they're overrated or underrated. You can feel free to answer with one word. You can feel free to answer and elaborate. But the idea is that sort of anyone could say something's good or bad, but the way you make money in investing is you have a view which is either one way or the other compared to everyone's expectations in a sense. So the first concept is the role of the power sector in driving decarbonization. Do you think it's overrated or underrated?
I'll give a 50-50 answer here. I think it's underrated by the public and probably overrated by policymakers.
Okay, interesting. Okay. I thought if there was ever one that if there was one you were going to say was underrated, it was that one, because we're talking about a quadrupling or a quintupling of
it's
power
definitely
demand.
No, but there's a big underrated piece in that one.
Yeah. Okay. Second one, carbon pricing to drive decarbonization globally. Is it underrated or overrated as a tool?
I suppose the history has shown that it's been overrated.
Certainly by economists.
Yeah, but I think carbon pricing has a huge role to play. But I think the other side of this is triggering the demand side, which is the pull by customers in terms of customers buying into the transition to low carbon.
Yeah. So we had Jonathan Brearley on. It's interesting. I think I asked Jonathan this one 6 months ago, who's the CEO of Ofgem in the UK. And he described, I didn't even ask him actually, he was depicting his career. And he said, it's, back in the early 2000s, he was doing government policy and it was a very common view. All we have to do is put a tax on carbon and that will solve, decarbonization. I think you would not find a single person in this sector who would say that carbon pricing, they'd have to have been in a textbook for a very long period of time before you ask them the question to say that. It has been a move in that. It's interesting you say historically it's been overrated. I entirely agree.
Just look at the evolution of the carbon price and the ETS.
Yeah. Well, it's doing a good job.
But like carbon is over 50 now, and it's driving certain things. I think it has a role to play. Definitely.
Yeah. The third concept is corporate PPAs as a route to market. and risk-sharing device for renewables investors globally. And by corporate PPAs, I don't mean I'm an independent power producer and I sell my offtake to ESB. I'm saying I'm selling it to Google, or I'm selling it to Amazon or Deutsche Bahn or something. Do you think they're overrated or underrated?
So I think these have a huge role to play that hasn't kind of crystallized yet. So underrated. I think that I believe, I'll be a bit provocative here now, right? So I think that, the large corporates who have big power requirements need to come to the table to make investments in green technologies happen. And they do this through corporate PPAs. And this is about the large consumers then making 15 to 20 year commitments to decarbonization, rather than just picking up power at the prevailing price in the market today. So I would say big role here, and they need to come to the table.
Yeah, interesting. We could go deeper on that one, but we won't. And then final concept, humanity's ability to keep global warming below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Overrated or underrated?
I say it's probably underrated. We just do not comprehend the step change that is needed. And we're probably all thinking, we're going to bed at night comfortably thinking that some magic bullet is going to come along and fix this.
Yeah.
And it's down to us and what we do.
Okay. Well, I think that's a positive, empowering message, right? And it sort of comes full circle to that message to all of you graduates and 25-year-olds out there. We huge challenge. We can do it, but it's going to take a lot of clever people engaged. That's a natural time to finish, Pat. So that was an absolute pleasure. I mean, it's not every day that you get the chance to benefit from someone's varied and very interesting career in the power sector over several decades. So, Pat O'Doherty, thank you so much for taking the time to speak.
Pleasure, John. Thank you.
That was John Feddersen, co-founder and chief executive of Aurora, speaking to Pat O'Doherty, CEO of ESB. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.